So, Dr. Dan Carter has been with the prairie enthusiasts since 2020. He is our ecologist and has been active in prairie restoration and reconstruction since the mid 1990s. He presently volunteers with our glacial prairie chapter of the prairie enthusiasts, which is in the southeastern part of Wisconsin. Dan is dedicated to restoring degraded pine oak barrens on a family property right now as site steward in Bayfield County. And with that brief introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Dan's recorded presentation, and then we'll check back in for a live Q&A once the presentation is concluded.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about old growth sods. This is probably also an excuse for me to talk about things that I think are cool. So let's just get into it by looking at some old growth sod. So if you ask me why I'm interested in prairie or why I'm passionate about prairie, I might have some difficulty at first giving an answer, or certainly in terms of maybe something the prairie does, like a job or a species or even a group of species. It's what prairie kind of intrinsically is. It's the complexity of it. From the first time I stepped on prairie and every time since, I've seen something new, or I've learned something. Even where the landscape is becoming more and more homogeneous, and even though there's so little prairie left, I mean, I can't, wrap my mind around a landscape prairie, but I can't wrap my mind around a square meter of prairie. That's just the nature of it. It's just amazing. So drilling down a little bit to something more concrete, I'm going to talk about some of the characteristics that old growth prairie and associated oak woodland and savanna sods tend to share. I'll talk some about how those characteristics can inform how we care for or sustain old growth sods. And I'll finish up by talking about how we can identify relatively good opportunities to restore degraded old growth sods, or even begin to reconstruct old growth like communities or ecosystems. A lot of this is hypothetical and needs research. There's a lot that's based on science, and there's a lot that's based on experience. One of the problems with a lot of the science when it comes to prairie, savanna, and oak woodland ecology is just the scarce recognition of what old growth is. And that comes through in interpretations, and it leads to a lot of gaps. So what is old growth sod? I would say it's synonymous with the word remnant, which we use a lot. It's a remnant of the original prairie, oak, savanna, oak, woodland sod. I like to use the term old growth because I think remnant emphasizes what's been lost. Old growth emphasizes, I think, what we still have, emphasizes process somewhat, maybe wisdom. So I like old growth. And if you wanted to try to pin down a definition from me, I would define it as a growth of mostly herbaceous vegetation and its associated organisms and soil that have developed relatively high diversity and complexity and have persisted for long periods of time without severe disruption of core ecological processes, and which are self-sustaining and predictable given those processes. So a mouthful there. So maybe a few more pictures just to kind of center and calibrate us about old growth sods. This is just a great example. This is Black Earth Redmond Prairie. You can look at this and think about, not just beauty, but um, complexity, ecological relationships, ecological processes. With experience, you can see how fire is interacting with this site. Wisdom. Later in the season, an old growth Music Prairie in west central Iowa. Same thing. Woodlands have herbaceous sods too, and I like to think about woodlands, oak woodlands in particular, this way because um, it's, I think, more important ecologically and from a conservation standpoint if there's an old growth herbaceous sod or one that can be restored, even than it is that there are old growth oaks. Um, if the oaks have been cut in the past and now all the trees that are there are several decades old or less, if there's an old growth herbaceous sod, it still can function like an old growth ecosystem and like an old growth grassland, like an old growth sod. So um, this is an example from under white oak with a continuous canopy, and you can see some more shade tolerant woodland species, but not too deep a shade. Things that like bright shade, like common wood rush and Pennsylvania sedge and Carolina vetch. But also you see some prairies that we might associate. I mean, you see some species that we might associate with prairies, like false toad flax and wood betony and two-flowered cynthia. Veldman gives us a definition for old growth grasslands, which I like because it's inclusive of savannas and open woodlands. And it gives us some more ecological characteristics. So old growth grasslands are ancient ecosystems characterized by high herbaceous species richness, and especially at a small scale, high endemism, at least relatively. Now, that's more true in tropical and subtropical old growth grasslands, but a lot of the more regional endemics that we have are also associated with prairies, savannas, and open woodlands. And unique species compositions, and that's because these things tune themselves to all the myriad physical gradients on the landscape. So there's a bunch of characteristics given in the tables below, and I'm not going to read through all of them, but I'm going to emphasize some of them that I think are important for how we approach caring for old growth ecosystems, old growth sods. One of them is that the seed banks tend to be transient. The seed banks from the predominant vegetation in old growth sods are transient. If we take some soil out of an old growth sod and grow up what's in it, short-lived species that are not predominant in the above ground community will be overrepresented. And if it's a system that has been degraded or it's deteriorating, or there haven't been, or for whatever reason, there haven't been recent seed inputs, a lot of the typical old growth species will just be absent from that seed bank because their seeds generally last a year. Some might last a couple, few, several years, and very few last more than that. And there tends to be little litter accumulation or duff, which is significant for nutrient dynamics and how fire interacts with the system. And a lot of the plants associated with old growth have growth strategies, growth forms that simply can't exist if there's a thick layer of litter or duff or thatch. They simply get smothered. A lot of the individual species tend to be slow growing and long lived and have low relative success establishing from seed and have poor colonization ability. And that's because their strategy is generally to live a long time and flower and produce seed fairly consistently with ebbs and flows, but they produce reliable but perhaps smaller inputs of seeds into a transient, a short-term seed bank. And if it happens to be a year where conditions align, where it's a good year for their establishment, they'll have produced some seed, and that's more their strategy. Fire also tends to enhance their flowering and fruiting. I think Justin Thomas adds another important dimension to this, and this is a hypothetical relationship. It's based on data, and I carry it forward here because it rings pretty true to me, and I think of it as a useful way to conceptualize what might be going on at sites. But what we have here on the y-axis is diversity, but also it's two components. So diversity is a function of how many species there are per unit area, the richness, and how equitable their abundance or representation is in that area, or evenness. So diversity is a function of richness and evenness, and these are all not independent of one another, and they're correlated. And it's a part of the characteristics that I shared on the previous slide. But we have a time dimension here. And there's some insights that this can give us. And first of all, so maybe we have early successional and late successional, and we get closer to old growth and late successional here. So maybe we've had a severe disturbance, like cultivation. And a site is initially colonized pretty quickly by a lot of annual and biennial plants, and some of those will have been in the seed bank. But certain perennials that are good dispersers have their seed colonize the site, maybe by animal vectors or by wind. In the Midwest, we might get a lot of clonal goldenrods, like tall goldenrod. We might get exotic cool season grasses, and these things are coexisting for a period of time. And so we have diversity, richness, and evenness increasing. But those perennial species, particularly early on, will quickly coalesce, and they will suppress, especially at small scales, those shorter-lived plant species. And so diversity, richness, evenness will decrease. The insight here is that given time, with intact dispersal or with facilitated dispersal, species that are perennial, that are efficient with their resources, that are maybe more specialized to the physical environment and to the other species maybe that occur at a site, will start to establish and develop relationships there, and we will move this way, and richness, diversity, evenness, those will increase again. And there are things that tend to co-vary with time. And the one I'm really going to emphasize here is nutrient, especially nitrogen availability. So shortly after that big disturbance, there's usually higher nutrient or nitrogen availability. And these opportunistic species that colonize early can really take advantage of that. They tend to grow fast. They tend to grow tall. Their litter tends to be fast decomposing at first, and that feeds back into fast nutrient cycling and high nutrient availability. That starts to slow down with more perennial vegetation, and especially if that system remains open and it becomes grassy, maybe it's exotic cool season grasses, their litter is a little slower decomposing. We start to build soil organic matter over time. We start to get more immobilization of nutrients there. We start to dampen down nutrient availability over time. And that just continues to happen sort of inexorably as we move towards old growth, maybe leveling out eventually. And this isn't how much is in the system, it's how much is available. A measure here, another perhaps more appropriate measure of the plant community than diversity, richness, or evenness, or one that is important to contextualize them, is mean coefficient of conservatism. And that's assigned to species based on their affinity for old growth, how restricted they tend to be to it. And so species that are conservative or have high coefficients tend to not be associated with high degrees of disturbance, but they tend to be associated with old growth. And those species tend to not be very represented early unless we're actively seeding them in, and then their relative abundance will tend to be low, but they increase over time in these systems, natural processes, especially if dispersal is intact. And and something to realize here is that while that is increasing, well, diversity, richness, and evenness might be increasing as well, or they might be decreasing. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It depends on the context. It depends on where the system is. And it's important to recognize that. So what I really want to emphasize is just because a system is here, maybe in that trough, maybe we have high dominance of some perennial species relatively early in the development of a system, it doesn't mean we need to hit the system with a hammer to try to boost diversity. We can set it back, and we can dial this thing back in time and push it back towards that first peak. But there's a different way that we can go, and that's what I'm talking about. And a core ecological process, and something that's at the center of that, and it's because it relates to nutrient availability in these systems. It's because it relates to the ability of these species to even establish and exist. It's dormant season fire, adequately frequent dormant season fire, which usually means very frequent dormant season fire. And why? Well, it will tend to volatilize nutrients, particularly nitrogen, but also it turns out that burning emits particles of phosphorus, aerosols and particulates of phosphorus from ecosystems, and phosphorus can also be deposited from the atmosphere, but it's a smaller flux. Fire creates small bits of charcoal, which help immobilize nutrients. If we burn in the dormant season, it gives some time for the pulse of nutrients that is not lost with the smoke to leach, perhaps through the soil profile, or to be immobilized by biological activity, even though that's going to be a slower process during the cool times of year. And it's not necessarily going to coincide with warm soils, when opportunistic species will be germinating and taking advantage. Nitrate is even a germination cue for some of those species. It's going to tend to promote species that produce slow decomposing litter, more recalcitrant litter, like grasses and sedges and oak, or at least adequate abundances of those to maintain flammability and nutrient cycling. Even some of the forbs are pretty flammable. If you've ever burned when it's getting dark and you light up some baptisia, it's like phosphorus. Dormant season fire will help maximize the establishment of old growth associated species with greater flowering, greater seed set, removal of obstructive thatch, both for new seedling establishment and simply so that it doesn't cause the elimination of species that have certain growth forms that can't penetrate that thatch. And in general, so in reducing nutrient availability, and generally we're going to be reducing the importance of competition for light and emphasizing the importance of competition for limiting nutrients. And what that does is it tends to reduce vegetation structure, because there's only a couple ways to compete for limiting light. It's to grow, those ways are to grow fast and to grow tall. There are lots of ways, many strategies to cope with various limiting nutrients, or with limiting nutrient availability in general. It might have to do with biochemistry or defenses of tissues from herbivory. Might have to do with seasonality of growth, or depth of rooting, or relationships to, or relative degrees of relationships to mycorrhizal fungi, relationships among plant species. These sorts of relationships, which are really foundational to the overall biodiversity and complexity in old growth systems. I really want to emphasize that old growth sods, um, for a given community type, a given prairie type, a given savanna type, tend to be usually um, relatively low in stature. So here we are in a low prairie, a wet to wet mesic prairie, in a little patch that's hanging on as old growth, and we're bent over. It's a seed collection workday, but we're looking at some cool stuff that's hanging on, and the prairie there wants to persist. It's not very productive. It's not smothering itself very fast. It's tending to produce a recalcitrant litter that's helping immobilize available nutrients when it's not getting burned. But what's happening here? Well, the overall landscape here isn't getting burned very often. And so this prairie is slowly smothering itself, and it's periodically getting burned and getting opened up, and we're getting colonization by more shrub willows and quaking aspen whose seeds need to hit bare soil. That's warm enough for them to germinate and has adequate moisture, and their seeds are only viable for a brief period of time, and they get growing and they start to change the nutrient cycling. They produce litter that's faster decomposing, and we start to also get colonization with them. Even if they're getting periodically topped off by burns, we start to get colonization by taller, more opportunistic herbaceous plants like Canada and tall and giant goldenrod, and you can see some common milkweed in the picture on the right hand side, which is great for monarchs, but it's not an old growth associated species. So this community is in flux, and we see kind of both states here. Climate change is a big problem, but I think nitrogen is a much bigger problem, or at least a more acute pressing problem. And so there's a lot here, but this is nitrogen deposition on the landscape. And so this is nitrogen coming down as particulates or in the rain that's just falling everywhere, fertilizing everything. And the left two panels, the left column, shows how oxidized nitrogen deposition, that's nitrate and nitrite, how those have decreased. And that's because they're mostly industrial sources, and regulation and policy has reduced that component of nitrogen deposition in the last couple decades. But the right two panels are reduced nitrogen deposition. That's ammonia and ammonium. And those primarily come from agricultural sources, in particular, the spreading of manure and fertilizers on the landscape. And that's a situation that's become much worse in the area that we operate in the last couple decades. And it's to the point now where the whole landscape where we work is getting fertilized with several to more than 20 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen per year. And that's significant. You know, it's not like fertilizing a cornfield. An extension agent might suggest a corn farmer put on the order of 10 times that much nitrogen on a cornfield, but it's still a lot of nitrogen. Everything's getting fertilized. And that's a problem that these systems face that we need to address the broader problem, but there are things we can do in our stewardship to address it. So property is critical to stewardship. First, I'll talk about low nutrient availability, particularly nitrogen, because a community that is limited by nutrient or water availability tends to be structured more by a community that is not limited by nutrient or water ability tends to be structured by competition for light. If you fertilize a community that was structured by limiting nutrients, if you start to fertilize it, it becomes tall and weedy and less diverse. That's what happens. So how do we do that? Well, one way is to burn frequently, to mine nutrients, to volatilize nutrients out of the system, particularly nitrogen, the nitrogen that's in the fine fuels, to produce charcoal that will also immobilize some nutrients and nitrogen in particular, and to provide time, because of the timing of the burning, for the associated nutrient pulse that is not volatilized to get immobilized or to leach through the system. We can also target problem species that contribute the most to altered nutrient dynamics, in particular nutrient availability. Oftentimes that's through the production of fast decomposing litter. So say you've got an oak woodland that has too many trees, is overstocked with trees. And usually you're going to want to be removing trees that aren't oaks from that system, but prioritize the ones that produce litter that decomposes very quickly. Things like white mulberry and box elder and black walnut. Um, excess shading is an issue, but the nutrient availability is a big part of the problem in those systems. Some of those species also foster soil bacterial communities that contain more nitrogen fixing members. Common buckthorn is an example of this. Under common buckthorn, there's a soil microbial community with more free-living, diazotrophic is the term, soil bacteria. That fertilizes the buckthorn, which produces this nitrogen-rich litter, which decomposes quickly, and it just creates this very eutrophic system on top of the shading, on top of the potential allelopathy from the emodin that the buckthorn produces. And there are legacies to that too when buckthorn is cleared, and that's important to consider. It's also important to avoid soil disturbance wherever possible because that releases nutrients. Avoid certain growing season practices in most instances, and that includes burning or grazing, in particular fenced grazing practices. And if you think about it, especially in old growth systems, we have these species, they tend to be efficient with their resources because they're long lived and they've got their hard won resources in their tissues. And during the growing season, if you take that and you spread it out and make it available for opportunistic species, it really can change the system over time. Recognize that killing vegetation, even invasive species, also releases nutrients, and that might have an effect on what you need to do to follow up. Minimize burn scars from brush piles. And that's something that we often can't avoid, but recognize that while some nutrients are going up with the smoke, a lot is getting left in a big heap of ash wherever you had the burn pile. And that's likely to be a chronic place where weedier, taller vegetation will tend to want to grow. And so here we see an example of that with ubiquitous burnweed, which likes to grow where there's been some sort of severe disturbance. And, its strategy is to reside in the seed bank for many, many years. And it also produces a lot of seeds, and its seeds will disperse by wind, but it sits in that seed bank for a long time, and here it's expressed itself around this burned brush pile. I put an asterisk on the previous slide next to that because there is some nuance here. So in some of our treed ecosystems, our fire-dependent forests and woodlands and savannas, there's some natural level of burning of coarse fuels. So things like logs and big limbs and things that burn hot and heat up the soil and maybe leave a little bit of excess of nutrients in their wake. And this little cranesbill, Geranium bicknellii, is actually a species that depends on that and has become rare. You can see the effects of deer browse there. That's another issue. Having minimal litter or duff is another important characteristic. That will tend to minimize fire intensity, and it will also prevent smothering of low-statured vegetation and any soil biological crusts. And it'll help facilitate new establishment of old-growth associated species if it happens to be a good year for the recruitment of those particular species. So to do this, we need to burn frequently enough that we don't have chronic buildup of thatch. If we don't, we'll have higher intensity fire due to that excessive litter, and that harms a wide range of old growth associated biota, plant and animal, and it creates larger individual pulses of nutrients. And so this is just a picture showing some excessive thatch that's built up between some prairie dropseed clumps in an old growth prairie. And it's lost much of its diversity, especially at smaller scales. And you can imagine when this burns, if it's dry, the fire is going to burn through the more recent production, but it's going to burn down through this thatch, and it's going to burn there for a long time. A lot of the species that were in that picture that I first showed you would have originally been here, but they're smothered by this kind of thatch. And once they're gone, they're going to be difficult to get back because many of them are not in the seed bank. I mentioned soil biological crusts. Soil biological crusts can occur on our prairies and even in some situations in savannas and woodlands. And those crusts require light. They require not being smothered by litter or thatch. They also require that the fire that happens not be so intense. At least the development of complex crusts requires that fire not be so intense that it damages them beyond recovery. So high intensity fire damages biological crusts, but crusts can't develop where long fire return intervals allow the soil surface to be covered with thatch or litter. And this is a picture of a biological crust at Black Earth Redmond Prairie in an area that's maybe a little drier, but it's productive enough that if this was burned every 3 or 4 years, that crust would not be able to develop. It'd be smothered by thatch. But this has been able to develop because fire is frequent enough that it gets enough light consistently and the intensity of that fire is low. And if you look at this crust that has had time to develop structural complexity, wonder about just how that structural complexity could be important to organisms that have their life cycles have nexus with the soil surface. Look at all that complexity and dimensionality there. Think about seeds, think about pupae, think about overwintering things in that crust. So I mentioned transient seed banks. So we need to consider that, and that the colonization of old growth species tends to be slow and they tend to grow slowly. They tend to be underrepresented in the seed banks. There tends to be greater representation of opportunistic species. Some of those species will be species we don't want. So what do we do in response? Well, we need to be very conscious of minimizing collateral damage. Degraded areas that have degraded for other reasons, will often require facilitated dispersal or planting, broadcasting seed, because the seed bank typically will not be there, or it won't be very representative of the community we're trying to restore. And the reestablishment of those species will tend to be slow anyway. Burning is also important if the system is flammable, because it will promote flowering and it will promote seed set, and it will minimize thatch and duff that will allow new recruitment of seedlings, and it will prevent smothering of old growth vegetation over time. So that will further promote recovery with time. So dormant season burning maximizes flowering in old growth associated species. And this is later in the season. The picture from Black Earth Redmond Prairie was earlier in the season, but the point is dormant season fire, it doesn't antagonize any of these species. It just lets them all thrive and grow and flower in their time and produces great abundance. There are caveats and exceptions. So not all the conservative species or old growth associated species are long-lived. We have some things like eared false foxglove, which have short lifespans and which flower once and die. And this species and the other species like it do tend to have seed banks, but the difference between them and burnweed is that their seed banks are shorter lived. They tend to be on the order of several years, and they don't produce as much seed to begin with. So they still require the regular removal of that thatch. Otherwise, their seed bank erodes and disappears, and they stop coming back and they're lost from the system. And that's why these sorts of species, these sorts of short-lived species have become rare, but certain other short-lived species with long-lived seed banks like biennial evening primrose and common ragweed and black-eyed Susans remain pretty common. A lot of what we often attribute to the seed bank really are just things that have become very small, and they've been dying their slow deaths in the shade, and they escape detection. So this hoary puccoon, I wish I had a picture of it when I first saw it, and it was just one little leaf, and I only saw it because I was sitting on a hill slope watching my kids play and just sort of looking at the vegetation that was next to me for a moment. And I saw it, and I kind of cleared out around it, and I put a cage around it to protect it from deer. And after a couple of years, it's gotten a little bigger, but it was dying its slow death in the shade. That's where most of these things are coming from. That affects how we need to manage our restoration projects, because we can lose these things. We often don't notice them, but we can lose them if we're sloppy or careless or overzealous with our herbicide treatments or other sorts of mechanical treatments in restoration projects. Areas like this that have been very densely shaded for a long period of time will have less. They'll have less representation of light-loving species. Those will have gone. They'll tend to retain more of the shade-tolerant species. Still, when we open these things up, and this is a red pine oak savanna, a pine oak barrens in the Northwest Sands. When we open these areas up, those species, those more shade-tolerant species, they still usually like it a bit brighter, and they'll start to fill in. So you see mostly Pennsylvania sedge and some shizacne, some millet grass starting to fill in here. Even though it was sort of thin to start. And so a lot of these areas will be sparsely vegetated, and they'll be missing species that were once present, in particular the more light-loving ones. So we've got to seed those back in because they're not in the seed bank anymore. Sky blue aster and wood betony were not in the seed bank anymore. They need to be seeded back in if they're going to reestablish at sites like this, and that's what you see in that inset. Here's a site where things have proceeded a bit differently. So this site was invaded by glossy buckthorn. It formed a large thicket. It was cleared. There was still some remaining low prairie and sedge meadow vegetation. But there was a lot of openness, and this was a decade ago. And there wasn't a lot of follow-up with buckthorn that was missed, new buckthorn that established. The community was pretty open. Phragmites, the Eurasian subspecies, blew in and colonized. Glossy buckthorn grew into a thicket again. You can see the thicket that in the background, but this in the foreground has been masticated or forestry mowed. The resprouts have just been foliar sprayed, and you can see looking down below the buckthorn that foliar spray has killed or damaged most everything else that's there, some native sedges, some sensitive ferns, swamp thistle, side-flowered skullcap, those sorts of things. And so what's going to happen now? What's going to happen now if we don't follow this up with seeding and burning and tamping down all of the other opportunists that are going to come back here? Well, we'll just be back here again in 10 years, masticating buckthorn and foliar spraying resprouts, and the cycle will repeat. So some notes on collateral damage. In existing old growth sods or sites with significant populations of old growth associated species, we should try to minimize the use of chemical treatments and use the most targeted approaches. And we have to use them sometimes. Sometimes it's the only practical thing to do, but don't assume that even targeted treatments don't have collateral effects, because they can. Look into or experiment with some of the low disturbance mechanical approaches like girdling or repeated growing season cutting, particularly where that's selective to the target woody stems. In some settings, it might even be less destructive to pull things than use chemical treatments, particularly in nutrient poor sites or sandy sites. Track not only treatment efficacy, but also collateral impacts. And you don't have to do a scientific study. You can take pictures. That works pretty well. So how do we identify, given these factors or these characteristics, some of our better opportunities to reconstruct old growth like communities? And the background here is a savanna pasture site dominated by exotic cool season grass, but it was never cultivated. It still has some remnant native species like early buttercup and balsam ragwort and field cat's foot. These things are all sort of avoiding of grazing or grazing tolerant. And you can see it's a bit nutrient limited. And the reason I know that is I look at the grass and I can see the livestock have come off recently, and there are the places where their excretions have fertilized the ground, and you can see little bits of taller grass, greener grass. So there's some nutrient limitation here. Well, what do we do? Well, I'll give you the example of Sugar River Savanna, which was a savanna pasture that was invaded by exotic cool season grasses, had remaining populations of native plants in low abundance, had species that had been eliminated. But this site basically has been treated like the savanna it is by the restoration of lost ecological process. It has been burned in the dormant season very frequently for the last 5 decades, I think all but 3 years. And where species had been lost, dispersal was facilitated back into the site over a period of about a decade, I think. And so with those two things, with very frequent dormant season burning and with facilitated dispersal, this site has recovered spectacularly. It's recovered old growth-like characteristics. This site, at least portions of it, have 25 to 30 species per quarter square meter. And those tend to be the conservative species of old growth savannas and prairies. That would compare favorably to any site in southern Wisconsin, even sites that haven't had the same kind of disturbance history. So it's done maybe something kind of like this. It wasn't starting from scratch, but it was a disturbed site, had some native species. Now it's a very rich site, and you go back here year to year, you can expect to see the same rich savanna. This is a site that is similar in a lot of ways. It was historically grazed, but over the last few decades, it hasn't seen nearly as much fire. It's seen some occasional brushwork, hasn't seen any facilitated dispersal, or hasn't seen very much. So what we have here is very high dominance of savanna running sedge, which is a grassy plant in the picture. We have other diversity, though. We have showy goldenrod and elm-leaved goldenrod and large flowered bellwort and a black oak recruiting there. This is a site that might have some potential. We could push it to the right, though, if we start burning it more often in the dormant season and ensuring that the dispersal of old growth associated species happens. We could also make it more diverse and rich if we created a lot of disturbance here, if we disturb the soil. Before a lot of the nicer species here would be extirpated, we'd get colonization by a lot of weedy species, and we could increase richness and diversity and evenness. But that's not what we want to do. We want to push this to the right. This is a pretty common situation, and this is a heavier lift because we don't have an old growth herbaceous sod anymore. This was a savanna pasture, a bur oak savanna pasture. The herbaceous community was degraded by pasturage, grazing stopped, and it was quickly invaded by common buckthorn. And at this point, the only herbaceous vegetation under the buckthorn is garlic mustard. So this is just a very eutrophic, high nutrient availability system. Oftentimes we would go at this by eliminating the buckthorn, maybe doing some work on the garlic mustard. Hopefully there's enough leaf litter to start burning. We hopefully would seed native savanna species into this. But typically what's going to happen if we don't seed native species is it'll get colonized by perennial species that are good colonizers, and they'll become dominant, and it won't be very diverse. It'll be like the picture on the left with a bunch of clonal goldenrod. If we seed initially with a good savanna mix, what's going to thrive are the species that can grow tall in response to high nutrient availability early on. A lot of woodland asters and goldenrods and purple Joe pieweed and the 2 giant hyssop species. And those will do really well. And they're not the most opportunistic of species, and this is a bit more rich, but this still isn't really realizing the potential of savanna or oak woodland. With more time, we can move this towards something like what we have on the right, when nutrient availability is settled down a bit more. Or we can maybe accelerate that process by cutting some of that taller herbaceous vegetation during the growing season and continuing to burn and continuing to seed in species more associated with old growth. And that's how the picture on the right looked like the picture in the middle. But this is after basically annual dormant season burning and growing season cutting and seeding in of more conservative species like yellow pimpernel and wood betony, and showy goldenrod versus elm-leaved goldenrod and things like that into the site. Old fields are a common situation, and they can be very receptive. This is an old field that was colonized mostly by smooth brome, but there were native species on the surrounding landscape, and they colonized it too. And so this, probably went through a trajectory where it had annual and biannual weeds, and then became dominated by the brome and a few good native plants that got in there. And we can move this to the right too if we treat it like an old growth system. This site has a very similar history. It's been recolonized by more old growth associated species and at higher abundances because it's a sandy soil that just tends to be lower nutrient availability. And so it's less prone to this over dominance by some of those early colonizing perennials that can grow tall and preempt light and prevent subsequent establishment. So it's maybe somewhere up there, and we can keep moving it to the right by burning and continuing to facilitate dispersal of missing species. So the most promising sites often are or have decades past the most recent significant soil disturbance. They're usually dominated by perennial herbaceous vegetation. I look at an old brome or bluegrass dominated field that's not vigorous is riper for planting old growth associated species than a field coming right out of row crop agriculture. They have low vegetation stature. They're flammable from the get-go. We can have ecological process from the very beginning. They already support a few or more native species that are associated with old growth prairie and oak ecosystems. And that's a clue that they could support more if only dispersal is intact or facilitated. So we can really distill this into something that's much more of a take-home message, I think. And a lot of it is about reestablishing an appropriate fire regime. And this is site-specific, and a lot of it has to do with productivity, but it's mostly dormant season fire, and it's usually going to be very frequent dormant season fire. And it's about facilitating dispersal in a fragmented landscape. A lot of those species just aren't going to get back there on their own, but we can have control over that when we can do that. We can overcome that. And if we think about this in terms of time, and this is decades, people. And I mean, decades for a lot of the changes, but these are communities that develop over periods much longer than that even, right? But it's about restoring ecological process, and it's about mitigating some of the problems we have with things like nutrient deposition, and that's using dormant season fire. So we have lower nitrogen availability, so we don't have chronic thatch and litter. And if we do that with time and with facilitated dispersal, if we're seeding and planting, species will establish. We'll have a cesis, which is like the coming home of species, or colonization, but I think coming home is a better way to describe it. They'll have a place to establish and make a home for themselves, and then with that, the different old growth associated species, the flora and the fauna, will have the time to develop their sort of myriad ecological connections, relationships, and complexity. And with that, there's maybe a little time for some questions. And so if we don't have enough time for all of the questions or discussion people would like to have, you can also find me in the chat, and I'll engage with people throughout the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. So we do have just a few minutes for questions here. We had some technical difficulties at the beginning of the presentation, so we're going to go a little bit long, but still let people go in time to get to the next presentation. So first I want to start with a question from Gabe Miller about whether mid-season mowing could be a tool for disturbance to set back the succession to that old growth sod system.
Well, I think I had a look at that, and haying was also a part of it, and I think that makes a difference. So the only reason some of our old growth prairies still exist is because their primary land use for a long period of time was for prairie hay. And so they were cut in the growing season, and that certainly affected their composition, certainly changed them, but it was less destructive to them than other forms of land use. And it allowed a lot of species to persist because what it did do on a consistent basis was remove nutrients and prevent the buildup of thatch and litter. So haying was beneficial and certainly preferable to, just pure fire exclusion and passivity and no interaction with that land over time, because those sites would have been lost otherwise. Mowing is more difficult to say because mowing can kind of break up the thatch and litter and reduce that problem some. It generally isn't removing nutrients. And so in the long term, I would say, I don't know. It's not very clear to me, but I would think it would have, it would be more disruptive than haying, certainly.
So what about invasive plants and their impact on the soil community? You talked a little bit about mycorrhizal fungi associations. When you look at the curve of development of a system into more highly diverse old growth system, how does the presence of invasive plants maybe set back in that timeline the progress that you're able to make in your restoration?
Well, it does, I think, and I think it's something that we should expect. And so I gave an example of buckthorn and the sort of the soil bacterial community associated with it. And so recovery not only there involves changes in that community, but also, time for the legacy it leaves of excessive nutrients to sort of mellow out. But it's also true that, the plants associated with old growth have relationships with mycorrhizal fungi. And some of those are limited in their ability to disperse and only disperse very slowly back into sites from edges and things like that. Ectomycorrhizal fungi, like on oak trees and stuff, those are faster because those are spread by spores. They produce mushrooms. But these are all factors in the time it takes.
So we're going to take just one more question, I think, before we let people go. And then I know, Dan, you've indicated a willingness to continue to return to the Whova interface to answer questions that might come up after your presentation. But can you help, especially those who are maybe a little bit more novice amongst our attendees, can you talk about the difference between oak woods and oak savanna and what kind of indicators you should be looking for as you're considering what you're restoring to as a landowner working on a project?
Yeah, that's a difficult one and a complex one, but there are several things you can look at for evidence. In Wisconsin, you can look at historical aerial photography. There's a viewer online, and you can look at late 30s air photos, and you can see what the canopy looked like then. You can also access historical land survey notes. There's a data viewer for those. And those can tell you, like, was it more timbered or more open savanna sometimes, but it's pretty coarse resolution. Other clues are in the site as it is now. So sites that are historically oak woodland, the trees tend to be taller with less big spreading lower limbs. Open savannas, the trees were much more open grown because they were more widely spaced. I see Deborah talking. But you can also look at the herbaceous plants. Those will also give you some clues as well. And if you try to restore something to open savanna that has none of those more light-loving species in it, it's not going to recover unless you add those.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Dan. At this point, we're gonna go ahead and take a break before our next session, which begins at 10:15. So thank you very much, Dr. Dan Carter, TPE's ecologist. We're really proud to have you as part of our team. And we'll look forward to additional insights that you have, again, in that interface on the chat. So those of you who have questions, please continue to enter those in, and Dan will pop in to answer them throughout the rest of the conference. We'll see you in the next session.